So I got a call from a police captain not long ago, as I do from time to time. I've been working in the field of policing in various capacities for over 30 years now. And this was the captain of a moderate-sized city in Florida. And he was familiar with my work, and he was expressing his deep frustration. His city, like so many cities in the United States, has a homelessness problem. And increasingly, the burden of that problem has fallen on the police department. And time again, this captain was forced to dispatch his officers to chase homeless people off the streets, sidewalks, parks, and other public spaces because of endless calls from business owners and local residents who wanted this problem out of sight and out of mind. And he was frustrated because he knew better than anyone just how futile this undertaking is. His city, like most cities, has very limited, extremely low-cost housing, few social services, and a completely inadequate social safety net. But even when services do exist, and occasionally there are services available, the services fail to address the actual needs of the populations being served. I recommend my friend Forrest Stewart's book, Down, Out, and Under Arrest, about the criminalization of homelessness in Los Angeles, in which he describes a growing archipelago of social services that endlessly cycle people through a process of neoliberal self-help pablum that never leads to housing, never leads to stable employment, never provides high-quality medical care. The three things that homeless people actually need. Instead, they are given transitional housing. Instead, they are given work readiness programs. Instead, they are given, at best, emergency temporary medical care. But homelessness is not the only problem area. There are close to 100,000 arrests of people for engaging in sex work in the United States. Almost entirely poor women of color. No lives are helped by these arrests. Prostitution is not eliminated, and the lives of these sex workers are not made better by these arrests. Now we hear, well, we should reframe this as an issue of trafficking. We should criminalize the Johns, not the sex workers. But this still does nothing to bring sex work out of the underworld of organized criminality, of client violence, and police harassment and abuse. It also does nothing to actually give people involved in sex work new opportunities to make meaningful changes in their lives if that is what they want. Between 1.25% of all people killed by police in the United States are having a mental health crisis. Most of them extremely poor people of color who lack access to basic medical care, especially mental health care. Their families, friends, acquaintances, and others call for help, and the help they receive is an armed police officer. Police go on literally millions of these calls every year at huge expense to taxpayers. Police do not have access to community-based mental health services, peer-to-peer supports, stable housing, the kinds of things that would actually make the lives of folks experiencing mental health crises better. Last year, there were almost 1.5 million low-level drug arrests in the United States. 1.5 million. Out of a total of 10 million arrests for all reasons. The war on drugs in the United States is alive and well. and continues to funnel millions of people into a prison system because they are poor, non-white, and sometimes have a substance abuse problem. We have been waging this war on drugs for 50 years. Drugs are cheaper, easier to get, of higher quality, and more deadly than they have ever been. We have absolutely nothing positive to show for this war on drugs, and yet it persists. We have systematically criminalized the behaviors of those who are in the most vulnerable positions in our society. And this is what the police actually spend all day doing. They are not chasing bank robbers. They are not finding hidden serial killers. They are not saving us from pedophiles. They are chasing homeless people out of encampments. They are patrolling the halls of our schools. They are going on mental health crisis calls, and they are waging an endless and pointless war on drugs. And the costs are too great. The financial costs. Our society is pouring billions and billions of dollars into an institution that is heightening injustice, not promoting justice. But the costs are also measurable in lives lost, and lives shortened, and lives made less whole. Police in the United States are responsible for 5 to 10% of all homicides in our society. They produce hundreds of thousands of serious injuries. But the medical measurable impact of policing on public health goes far beyond that. The trauma of experiencing, witnessing, or even hearing about ongoing police harassment and violence has measurable negative impacts on life expectancy and quality of life for those subjected to it. Recently, the American Public Health Association, at its national meeting, passed a resolution identifying police violence as a major public health problem in the United States, the solution to which is less policing. Not more training, not body cameras, less policing. Finally, the costs are ideological. Every time we say to a community that the solution to their problems is armed police officers, we are re-legitimating the idea that the problems that they are experiencing are the result of individual and group moral failure that will only respond to violence, coercion, control, and death. And this undermines a logic of actually addressing the underlying social problems that are the root of all these police interventions, that are driving the 911 calls, that are driving the desire of residents to have problems swept out of sight and out of mind. So how did we get into this mess? Well, the reality is that for the last 40, 50 years, we have systematically defunded some of the most essential services. Why? Because we have embraced an economic system rooted in an ideology of free market capitalism that says that under the pressures of global competition, all we can do is subsidize the already most successful economic actors in hopes that some of that wealth will magically trickle down to the rest of us. It's not actually about free markets. That's just an ideology. What we see is that cities are actively intervening in markets, not to lift up the poor, not to create greater social equity, but to subsidize the already most successful. When Amazon wants to build a new building. They shop it all over the country to see who will give us the biggest tax breaks, who will give us the biggest subsidies, who will give us the least regulation, who will allow us to pay the lowest wages. Now, it's very true that no city wants to look like Detroit. Under the pressures of globalization, Detroit was abandoned by capital, left to its own devices, abandoned by the federal government, and suffered tremendous consequences for that. But the alternative does not have to be what New York City did, which is to put all of its eggs in the basket of high finance. Now, New York looks great on the surface. We've got 80-story buildings everywhere you turn. Manhattan has become a playground for the world's rich. But we also have the highest levels of homelessness since the Great Depression. 10% of New York City school kids can expect to experience homelessness in a given year. We have widespread poverty. We have lack of access to basic health care. We have tremendous inequality. The advantages that have been experienced by the Jeff Bezoses, as Angela Davis pointed out earlier, are not trickling down to the rest of us. Instead, they are producing the problems of mass homelessness, untreated mental health and substance abuse problems, failed schools, involvement in black market activities like drugs and sex work, and then those problems have been redefined as problems of crime and disorder to be managed by policing, not solved. No amount of chasing homeless people around the block solves homelessness. What it does is it makes residents feel better for an afternoon. So how do we get out of this mess? We have to demand real solutions to our problems. I thought Angela Davis said this kind of nicely earlier. Capitalism is a problem, but we can't wait till we get rid of capitalism in some broad, somewhat abstract, long-term sense to do something about these problems. We can take concrete action now to build a better world that creates the possibility of broader transformation. We can establish new civic logics about how we approach our problems. We can demand real justice. We can say, why can't we have high-quality, medically based drug treatment programs in every community? Why can't we have adequate harm reduction services? Why can't we have community-based, peer-to-peer mental health systems? Why can't we have basic income supports? Why can't we have, as Julian Castro pointed out earlier, why can't we have massive new investments in public housing? This requires establishing a worldview that says government has a role to play, not just in subsidizing the wealthy, but in making economic development more horizontal, to making sure the benefits are enjoyed by everyone. And in the process, we reject the worldview that says our problems are going to be solved through coercion, control, and violence. And instead, we embrace a civil culture based on the values of care, compassion, and solidarity. Very much like the ideals of Veritas, Unitas, and Caritas. Thank you.
So thank you. Now that I got my mask off, I'm going to take a deep breath, but not so deep that I breathe on all of you. So So thank you so much for having me here today. Thank you, Paul and Christine, for your generous gift that not only allowed this particular symposium, but that has funded Stephanie's position and just really not only put this into motion, but I think that this is just such the beginning of seeing this anti-poverty work that so many people have spoken about already continue to take root and really spread. So thank you so much for that. So there's been dozens of speakers that have come before me, and so I want to thank all of those who have spoken, to my fellow panelists, and all of you who are listening. My guess is that if you are here, anti-poverty is not simply an interesting discussion, as interesting as this discussion has been, but that it's been part of a much more deeply seated truth for you. So many of you who have gone before me today, like literally and figuratively, have been fighting to eradicate poverty for years. And so in many ways, some of the remarks that I had sort of thought about and prepared seem, a little bit silly for this particular audience. Convincing people to care about these particular issues, it's kind of like preaching to a choir right now. And there's literally kind of feels like an echo chamber in that way. But when I think about my comments, I want to sort of build on some of the things that have been said today and tie it in to my own work and my own scholarship. And so one of the things that Alex just mentioned was this idea that the government has a role to play. And there's no question that the government is playing a role in all of this right now. And one of the bigger questions I really want to raise today is to think about and identify what role not only the government's playing, but what role we're all playing and what role we should be playing in all of this. So we started off the day with Father Peter talking about the common good, and it's been an idea that has come up several times throughout the day, and we're reminded of it as we look at our crest and the ideas of veritas, unitas, and caritas. And it's something that we say all of the time, but this idea of the common good, that the sum total of social conditions which allow people either as groups or individuals to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily. And I think that's what's so clear is that when we think about poverty, when we think about the unhoused, there's no more clear of an example of where we are falling short as a society, where we are failing to reach that common good. And so I think the question becomes like, how are we going to, one, are we going to identify this as a problem? I think, again, everybody here has already, but then once we have, how are we going to solve that problem? And as others have said, police have become such an important, or such an, I won't say important, but an integral or major way in which we deal with the unhoused. And police are frustrated and people are frustrated. And one of the things that all too often happens in these situations is that it leads to arrest, that it leads to violence. And the question becomes, how can we put an end to it all? What is there to sort of act as a stopgap? And as a civil rights scholar and someone who has taught and thinks about criminal procedure and the police on a daily basis, I often think about sort of the ties that bind us. One of the things that makes policing really complicated is that it's a very localized endeavor. And our police department looks very different across the country. And the rules that govern sort of from localities to states can vary. What sort of union contracts exist and what indemnification rules can exist can vary drastically. But one of the things that is a common denominator amongst all of these police departments is the Fourth Amendment. And the Fourth Amendment, amongst other things, essentially guarantees the right to be free from an unreasonable search and seizure. But all too often, we have people who are arrested when they shouldn't be arrested, who are the victims of police violence, police force. And the question becomes, like, why is the Constitution failing? I mean, there's so many failures in the systems that we've talked about, but why is the Constitution, which is supposed to be so much of the backbone of our democracy, why isn't that holding up against this pressure? If all else is going to fail, why is the Fourth Amendment failing us? And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that our Fourth Amendment standard is far too low. It's too easy to sort of stop, investigate, and arrest people. The standard for stopping people is a reasonable, articulable suspicion. For those of you who haven't taken criminal procedure, let me just say that this is a very, very low percentage in the grand scheme of things. Your ability to stop and question somebody, and even your ability to search them, and then your ability to arrest them is just based upon probable cause, which isn't much higher. And so what we're talking about is really low standards to get people wrapped up in a system. Now, part of the problem of once you start talking about poverty is that once you get wrapped up into that system, given the way our bail system works, your ability to get out of that system is really, it's difficult. And we've seen so many people who spend time in jail for crimes that may not even actually be a jailable offense simply because they can't afford bail. And so one of the problems that we're dealing with is the Fourth Amendment. The other problem is setting aside sort of arrest and then thinking about the police use of force is that we have too many instances of police violence. And as a previous speaker alluded to, so much of this police violence is a consequence of police not being trained adequately, or just to be frank about it, that police are not appropriate for these situations. I've said before, I think on a radio program once, that if you're dealing with, having, a heart issue, you probably don't want to necessarily, you might start off at your general practitioner, but eventually you're going to want to see a cardiologist, and that we have specialized needs, but yet when we could think about our system of policing, we just dial 911. Now, even our 911 system's a little bit more nuanced, though, because when we think about it, if we have a fire, the fire truck comes. I feel like I'm talking to my 5-year-old right now. The way if you call the 911, there's a fire truck, there's the ambulance, and there's the police. But the idea is that there's different issues that arise in our society, and we have different responses for those. But yet our police are called on to do so much of the work, of the social service work, and we need a far more nuanced system than just the police. But let's assume that you actually get to the point of being able to establish liability and that there has been a Fourth Amendment violation. So I'm skipping really far ahead now because I don't have much time and I know other people have really important things to say. But let's skip to that point and say that you establish liability. There's going to be a question about whether you're actually going to recover. Now, let's say you do recover. In order to recover, you'd have to overcome qualified immunity, which is something that's appeared in the news so many times now, which again, I'm not going to talk about. But what I really want to get to is this idea of if you've recovered and if we have blamed an individual police officer for your harm, you might believe that the police officer is going to be held accountable. But in fact, that's seldom going to be the case. The way that our system actually works now is that almost 99% of the time, almost always, police officers are going to be indemnified. And that means that the municipality is going to pay for whatever damages that they have caused. So it's not going to be the police officer paying it, it's going to be the municipality. But what we all know, though, is the municipality it's a legal fiction in many ways, in the sense of it's a legal creation. So when we ask who is really paying when we think about the municipality, This sort of takes us back. I've never actually tried to tie the common good to the tax system before, but my mother was a tax professor, and so I feel like it's appropriate in this instance. But it's the individual taxpayers who live in the municipality who are actually paying. And so it's you and me and everybody else. And so what this means is that at the end of the day, we're all paying for it. But this should give us pause to ask some of these bigger questions. Because if we're all paying for it, what we really want to ask ourselves is this what we want to be paying for? And it takes me back to my initial point, which is the government is involved in this no matter what. The government is currently paying for so many of the damages that are inflicted by our current systems. And we're paying in a way that's very much ex post. And what I think we need to do as a system is adopt a more ex ante system, one in which we're attempting to avert harms before they occur as opposed to paying for harms after they've already inflicted their damage. So many of these things are just never going to be compensated. You can't make up for the things that are lost in these situations. You can't make up for lives lost. You can't make up for dignity lost. You can't make up for opportunity lost. And so what we need to do is reimagine our system. And so when we think about this on a monetary basis, when we think about this as a system of tax, it really leads to what so many people have talked about with this idea of defunding the police. I will say it is not my favorite catchphrase, but I think it's an important one. It is much less about defunding the police in a literal way as a call for us all to think about the systems for which we're paying. And so many people think that it's just about not paying the police, when it's really about having a bigger image of our system of municipal budgets and thinking about how should we be spending this money that we are already spending in order to better avert these harms. And so what I think that, I will add to this discussion that has been, so what I hope to add to this discussion is just for us to really refocus on how we're thinking about the system as a whole and the way in which it is so interconnected. If there's anything that we've learned in the past few years, it is that each one of us is so connected to the other. And so we started off today talking about the common good. And I guess what I'd hope to leave you with at this moment is that perhaps if morals won't tie you together, money will. And we are going to pay for this one way or the other. So to quote, not my mother didn't make this quote, but I had mentioned her, and she'd be proud to know that I was talking about her now, but as a tax professor, she told me that taxes are the cost of a civilized society. Right now, we do not have a civilized society. When we have so many people suffering from poverty, and the consequences that stem from that, it's time that we think about this from not just a moral standpoint, but from a monetary standpoint. So we are paying already, so ask where you want your money to go. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you especially to Stephanie for including me in this amazing day of reflection and thought and calls to action. I want to talk a little bit about the work that we do and why I think it's important. But first, I want to try to set the context. We are living in a society that is putting human beings in cages at rates that are unprecedented in the recorded history of the modern world. Right now, as I'm talking to you, there are 2.3 million human beings in cages. There are 450,000 human beings every single night in 3,153 local jails all over this country who are in cages prior to trial, even though they're presumed innocent, solely because they don't have enough cash to pay cash bail. We cage Black people at a rate 6 times that of South Africa at the height of apartheid. It's impossible to have a discussion in a room like this about these issues without understanding the ways in which our society has utterly normalized human caging in a way that no society has ever done. And not only have we normalized it, But in rooms all across this building and in other buildings like it, we have rationalized it. And in fact, we've called it justice. And I want to understand a little bit about that process, because I think it's important to understand, like, how did we go from something that is so abhorrent and so grotesque and so devastating to so many people? Keep in mind, there's an unknown number of children who are separated from their parents every year in this country. We know it's several million, but we don't know the exact numbers because nobody has bothered to count. This is the situation we're in, and how did we get to the point where all of us think this is not only normal, but that we call it justice? In fact, we have a department of the United States government that is the most significant human caging force in the history of the modern world that's called the Department of Justice, okay? And I want to understand that, and I want to talk about it a little bit. So I think the only way I know how to do that is really to talk a little bit about my own experiences. So I quit my job as a public defender several years ago. I was very fortunate to get a grant from Harvard Law School to start my own nonprofit organization. I remember I went in to like pitch the grant, and I had a bunch of poster boards because I'm not really a technology kind of person. And they were like, "What do you want to do if we give you this money?" It was the first time they were ever going to fund alums to do their own nonprofits. And I said, "I'm going to dismantle and abolish the criminal punishment bureaucracy." And they just like totally laughed. And I went home thinking like this interview was a real disaster. I should have led with like, I want to do some reforms here and there, you know, but that didn't feel true to the scope of the task that we faced. And luckily for me, nobody else remotely qualified applied for the money. And I was able to get this money. And so the first thing I did with Harvard's money was I flew back to Alabama, where I had started my career as a public defender. And before I went and visited some of my old colleagues and friends, I drove from Birmingham to Montgomery and stopped in municipal courts all along the way, went from jail to jail and court to court. I would interview people's families as they were coming out of court. And I got to downtown Montgomery, and I went to the local municipal court, where I had never been because I was a federal public defender. I was defending people charged with federal crimes. The main federal crimes are possessing a plant that's on a list of substances you're not allowed to possess, crossing an imaginary political boundary between two countries that was created through imperial conquest without having been born on the right side of that boundary, and possessing a firearm, having been convicted of one of those other two offenses. Those are the three main federal offenses that constitute the bulk of federal prosecutions. That's what I was dealing with. What I didn't have a great sense of is what was going on in the rest of the criminal punishment bureaucracy. And it turns out that the rest of the criminal punishment bureaucracy is almost entirely happening off record. Okay? There's no court reporters, there's no audio recordings, there's no videotapes, and we don't even actually know how many cases there are. A scholar named Sasha Nadapov has tried to count how many criminal offenses and cases there are in these local municipal courts around this country, and she sort of threw up her arms and said, I can't do it. It's tens of millions, okay? And so I went to the local Montgomery Municipal Court, and I walked in there, and there were 67 people in jail garb and chains that morning. All of them were black. Not a single one of them was actually charged with a crime. They were all there because they owed debts to the city of Montgomery. The city of Montgomery had privatized their traffic debt with a private probation company, and they hadn't been able to make the extra fees the probation company wanted. So the probation company put arrest warrants out, and they had all been arrested. And one by one they came up. Your Honor, I'm a homeless veteran. Please don't jail me. Your Honor, I'm a single mother of 4 children. One of my children is disabled. I promise you I'll take the money from her disability check and give it to you. Just don't put me in jail. Your Honor, I recognize I've made mistakes in my life. I've been addicted to drugs. I just don't have the money. Please don't put me in there. And every single one, pay me $1,000, pay me $1,400, pay me $2,200 or you go to jail. For reasons I won't get into in this talk, I was removed from the courtroom, but I went next door. In Montgomery, like in many other U.S. cities and towns, the jail is both physically and metaphorically connected to the courtroom. Because policing and all of the injustices that the previous presenters have talked about are not possible without the veneer of law. They're not possible without lawyers contributing and justifying and rationalizing that violence. They're not possible without the judge ordering it. And so jails and courts are connected. In Montgomery, they are actually physically connected. I went up to the jail and I started meeting with people, and I met a woman named Charnel Mitchell. And Charnel had been sitting on her couch with her 1-year-old in her lap and her 4-year-old next to her when the police raided her home, and they tore her away from her children and arrested her on 4-year-old traffic ticket debt that she had not paid. And she'd been away from her children, had no idea where they were for the last couple of weeks. And when she got to the court, her court document, which she showed me, said, pay us $2,807 or do 59 days in jail. And Charnel explained to me that she just was so desperate to get back to her kids that she would do anything. And she flipped over her court document. On the back, she'd been writing in a pencil that a guard had given her each day, 1 through 59, and each day she was writing a dollar amount, 50, 50. Some days she was writing $75. And I asked, what's going on? And she said, well, in Montgomery, if you agree to be a janitor for the judges and the jailers, and you clean the feces and the blood and the mucus and the mold and the urine from the floors where all the women were sleeping on top of each other, you get an extra $25 a day toward your debt. So all the women were competing every day to be modern debt peonage slave laborers for the city of Montgomery to pay off their traffic debt so they could get back to their children. By the time we talked, and we were finished talking, her tears had smudged all of her calculations, and she had no idea when she'd be getting back. And that morning, Charnel became my first client as a civil rights lawyer, and along with 4 other people I met in the jail before, I was also removed from the jail. And within a couple of weeks, we were before a federal district court judge in Montgomery, and the judge was so outraged at what was happening. It may surprise those of you who've been to local courts in any city or state in this country, but it is actually illegal to put someone in a cage just because they can't make a monetary payment. It's a separate issue about sort of the Constitution in this country is not self-executing, and so the gap between the way the law is written and the way the law is lived and experienced by very poor people is enormous. But the judge ordered the city of Montgomery and all its officials to come in person and explain why they had been doing this. How could this be happening? And instead of coming and explaining themselves, they released everyone from the jail in a single day. And that was a really profound moment for me because it was a major U.S. town just releasing everyone from jail without a care in the world. So normalized had human caging become that they stopped having good reasons, let alone reasons at all, for putting human beings in a cage. And right after that happened, Michael Brown was murdered in Ferguson. And I read an article in the New York Times that was quoting some statistics in Ferguson. It looked like the same kinds of problems I saw in Montgomery were happening in Ferguson. And so I went to Ferguson and embedded myself with the people that were on the streets every single night protesting. And it turned out Ferguson averaged 3.6 arrest warrants for every household. Almost every arrest warrant for a black person, almost every warrant for unpaid debt. And it turned out that 89 municipalities around Ferguson also were doing the same thing. And then it turned out, as I started doing this work around the country, that virtually every city and town I went to, whether it was Tennessee, Mississippi, California, Illinois, Pennsylvania, they were doing the exact same thing. 500,000 people are jailed in Texas every year to sit out their court debts. This is an entire shadow legal system that no one ever talks about on the news, right? And then as we were doing that work, it occurred to us that the very same constitutional violation, no human being should be put in a cage because she can't make a payment, is the very core of the American money bail system. The only difference with the money bail system is it's prior to trial. You haven't even been convicted of your traffic ticket yet. You haven't even been convicted of your crime. You're in a cage separated from your children because you can't make a payment. And the more I studied this, the more I saw how these systems sort of evolved in clear ways from the early sort of post-Civil War police and local legal systems that were really designed to extract black wealth and to dominate and control the lives of very poor people. And they had sort of become proceduralized. They'd become justified. They'd become rationalized through a century of Supreme Court criminal procedure jurisprudence, so that what we ended up having was a lot of the same outcomes. These systems were still controlling and dominating and extracting from the poorest people in our society. They were still using instruments of state violence to preserve existing distributions of wealth and racial supremacy, but they had all new terms and names. And it turned out that basically everything I was looking at had once been called a reform, right? In fact, the prison system was supposed to be a reform. And they've been talking about reforming prisons ever since they were founded. The probation and parole systems were then the reform to prisons. Well, why are you putting so many people in prison? And now probation and parole is the single biggest source of new admissions to prison in the United States. 25% of people admitted to state prisons in the US are there for a technical violation of probation or parole, meaning they have not even been accused or convicted of a new crime. Another 15% are minor violations of probation and parole. So that was a reform. And then the more you look at all of this stuff, the bail system, Again, it was reform. And then when the federal courts reformed the bail system in the 1980s, because the bail system everyone had realized that was also having the same detrimental effect on poor people and people of color, they ended up reforming it with this new thing called pretrial detention. And they ended up tripling the rate at which human beings were separated from their families and caged prior to trial. The same thing is true with body cameras, right? Alex mentioned them a little bit earlier, but that was sold to everyone in the Obama years as the solution to police brutality. So instead of asking questions like, why are we having police? Why are they in these neighborhoods? Why are they only targeting very poor people for crimes connected to survival and not investigating the crimes of the rich? Why, for example, is there $50 billion of wage theft in this country that is never investigated or prosecuted by police? 5 times the total amount of all burglary, shoplifting, motor vehicle theft, every other kind of property crime. Why is that not considered a crime, right? And it turns out that, like, if you look at the body camera debate, those were not the questions that were being asked. The questions that were being asked were, how do we put surveillance cameras on cops so that we can watch them do the same thing they're currently doing in the same neighborhoods, right? And it actually turns out that it was the police themselves that had come up with the idea of body cameras. They were pushing it for a long time and couldn't get the funding for it. So what did they do? They allied their cause with liberal civil rights reformers, and they knew that if they got liberal local governments and the liberal Obama administration to fork over several $1 billion, they could equip every single police officer in the United States with a camera that could watch them do what they do, and that would be the best source of evidence that they could now use in prosecutions of poor people. And that's the way it turned out. And they also had another plan. They wanted to connect body cameras with a new wave of voice and facial recognition software in large databases by companies like Microsoft, Amazon, Palantir. This was the plan all along, and yet liberal reformers walked us right into it. They spent billions of dollars over the last decade giving every cop in this country who wants one a surveillance camera that the cop controls and that doesn't hold them accountable for all of the violence that they perpetrate. And so I should end now, but I guess the provocative thing that I want to say is, and maybe this differs from what a couple of the prior panelists have said, is when I look across American history, when I look actually at the way that police forces similarly are used in throughout the Western world, I see a police force whose main function is to preserve whatever existing distributions of wealth and power exist in that society. They are sort of a tool of the class of people who own things to keep things looking the way that they look, right? So the reason that if I'm hungry, I can't go into a grocery store and take a piece of bread is that there is the imminent threat of police violence against my body. If my family used to have a piece of land in Alabama and it was taken away from them in the 1870s, and now there's another family that owns that land, and I'm struggling with homelessness because of the way that Alabama has divested from communities of color, right? If I'm a black family in outside Birmingham, Alabama, that doesn't have a place to live, the thing that's stopping me from going into the guest house or the spare bedroom of a family who owned the plantation and now owns that land is the threat of imminent violence by the police. This is how distributions of wealth, distributions of racial supremacy have been perpetrated, and this is how they are enforced, right? I don't know if any of you saw last year, there was a group called Moms for Housing in Oakland that were being evicted from their home in Oakland. What happened? The sheriff's department in Oakland sent tanks and armed agents of the government to evict. And the owner of the house was a speculator real estate development company that was getting subsidies from the city of Oakland. So when I look at Western societies, when I look at this country's history, I don't actually see any evidence of the government with its benevolent motives needing to play a stronger role, and we should be trying to convince the government to do investments in things that help communities instead of state violence. I actually see sort of an evil force. I see all forms of state power and coercion as necessarily invested in justifying existing distributions of wealth. And so when I look at solutions to these problems, I'm looking less at trying to convince our political system as it currently exists to invest in things that are going to lead to its own destruction. I'm much more interested in what ordinary human beings are doing all over the country, organizing together in ways that are outside of the existing power structures. I'm interested in mutual aid cooperatives. I'm interested in worker-owned cooperatives that are actually democratizing the spaces that we all exist every single day. And I think the only way that we change some of the underlying individualistic mentality that led to some of these violent systems being created is if we actually develop a new ethos of solidarity and care. And I don't see that happening through the government. I see it happening through all of us coming together every single day in our daily lives. Like the really beautiful presentation that, I forget your name, but the presentation that you made about the work you're doing in the community, keeping people alive. And that you're not doing it because the government is paying you to do it. You're not doing it because some corporation is, you're not doing it for financial profit. You're doing it because human beings have a connection to each other. And sort of the neoliberal world order that Alex talked about has been all about severing those ties that bind us. And so I'm really interested in exploring with all of you, what are the ways in which we can build that sense of solidarity again? Because I fear that all the government investments we want, we can create many new bureaucracies all over the place. We can create a child welfare bureaucracy, and we can create a healthcare bureaucracy, and we can create all of these new institutions, and I don't think any of them will actually solve these problems unless we fundamentally build the relationships that we need with each other and our own communities. So thank you.
Hi, my name is Amelia Carter. I'm the writer and director of the stop-motion animated film Testimony, 52nd Street and the Invisible Violence of UPenn. This film is about my personal experience with police violence following unrest sparked by the murder of George Floyd. We're going to pause now to watch the film. It's only about 8 minutes long. Due to COVID, this is the first time I've actually shown this to a room full of people, so thank you for being among the first. So as you can see, this film is also about how this experience changed me. From the shock of realizing that my employer and alma mater, the University of Pennsylvania, sent their private police force to participate in the attack, through my journey in trying to hold them accountable. I ultimately founded Penn Community for Justice, a grassroots organization and the producer of this film project, to mobilize colleagues, students, and the greater community around this work. Through our campaigns, we raised awareness that the hashtag Fund Communities Not Cops was bigger than 2020. And in the case of the 52nd Street crackdown, has its roots in university-driven gentrification. For me, this is the entry point for understanding the relationship between this esteemed leader in education, policing, and poverty. Penn built the bulk of its wealth through a land grab in West Philadelphia that resulted in the displacement of thousands of Black people from the Black Bottom neighborhood, now known as University City. In urban institutions like Penn, campus police often act as a mechanism for preserving the assets of their employers. They are privatized, militarized arms of the university system, used to cleanse these new campus communities of outsiders, creating artificial pockets of privilege in the midst of public deprivation. Through this process, power brokers like Penn have built what historian Dr. Devarian Baldwin calls quasi-autonomous republics in the heart of the city. In robbing our public coffers through tax avoidance via nonprofit status, this multi-billion-dollar institution chooses to give back to our depleted communities through service learning programs, where untrained undergraduates are offered up as solutions to our notoriously understaffed and toxic public schools. Schools that serve an overwhelmingly Black and brown population and rely on funding from property taxes that Penn does not pay. With this approach, how can our institutions prove that Black lives matter in the age of racial reckoning and the fight for economic justice? We argue that the best way for Penn and other tax-exempt mega nonprofits to shift this dynamic is through divesting from their private police forces and investing in payments in lieu of taxes or pilots towards our public schools at a rate of 40% of foregone property taxes, a figure that's about $40 million per year in the case of Penn. After months of tireless organizing with dozens of groups that included student activists from high schools educators, staff, faculty from across the city. The Pilots movement did culminate in Penn's historic donation of $100 million to the school district of Philadelphia, $10 million broken up over 10 years to be exact. While we were excited for this news, a limited gift is not a true Pilots agreement, and that amount falls far short from what our schools so desperately need. Our schools are not charities and cannot be sustained by random acts of benevolence. Quality education is a right that requires an overhaul of our public finance system to ensure that our wealthiest institutions consistently pay their fair share. Since private institutions like Penn have lobbied hard to make sure that that doesn't happen, we have to continue to fight for this concession. Despite our hesitation in claiming this small victory, it is a testament that we can create change within our institutions. It shows us that when we organize, we can win. For me, the protest era of 2020 was a warning. Tomorrow's uprisings won't be a performance in empathy or an expression of outrage. Instead, I predict, a rash of transformational campaigns targeted at institutional policies that sustain the economic violence of wealth hoarding in the face of poverty. Superficial commitments to diversity and weak claims of economic stimulus via low-wage work are no longer enough to feign integrity. Now is the time to reshape our institutions into leaders in equity through radical changes in our own policies and practices. Now is the time to ask hard questions like, where does my institution stand in the perpetuation of inequity, and what am I doing to change it? Thank you.